Call of the Bully, Chapter 24, is called Groundbreaking News. I was soaked, shivering, and completely exhausted as I climbed from the canoe, but it didn't dampen the excitement that I felt as a horde of campers and counselors charged onto the dock to greet us. I quickly learned how a college basketball team feels when the student body rushes the court after a championship game. Allison and I had to duck in behind Josh to keep from being crushed or knocked into the water. Kids I hadn't noticed all summer were slapping us on the back, and they all seemed to be shouting at once, "Way to go! You saved the camp! Amazing! Someone finally beat the Algonquins!" Perhaps the biggest kid of all pushed his way through the crowd. "Well done, Rodney!" Mr. Periwinkle beamed. "I knew you could do it." "Really?" "No, but let's go celebrate." The pandemonium lasted for at least an hour. Throughout it all, I was cheered, tugged, hugged, congratulated, and forced to recount our adventure. It was almost as tiring as the canoe race. Most of it blurs in my mind, with the exception of one mental snapshot. For a brief second, the crowd parted, and I noticed a sour-looking group off to the side. Mr. Vanderdyck, Mrs. Lutz-Kraut, and their henchmen leaned against a table, not speaking. They appeared to be in total shock. Their faces wore an expression of disbelief. Above them, gold and black balloons spelled out Vanderdyck Mall Groundbreaking. I gave a little wave. Thatcher broke their trance. Vanderdyck snapped the handle of a gold-plated shovel over his knee and stormed off. 3 guys in black suits disappeared among the kids. Lutz-Kraut, on the other hand, remained motionless. Her eyes, staring deep into mine, flashed a look of horror and hatred. I didn't dwell on her feelings. Right behind her, I could see that the table was piled high with fancy sandwiches, 2 big hams, at least 5 different desserts. You name it. Vanderdyck must have had the groundbreaking ceremony catered. I hadn't eaten a real meal in 48 hours, and my stomach rumbled. As Lutz-Kraut lifted a glass of champagne to her lips, I turned to my 100 new friends and yelled, "Let's get some food!" The crowd loved the idea, but not Mrs. Lutz-Kraut. She dropped the champagne glass and ran screaming from the approaching mob. We surrounded the table and attacked it like a pack of wolves devouring a deer. As I gnawed on some shrimp and a lobster tail, I figured the spread had been meant for us, but I didn't care. It was celebration time, and I earned it. And the celebration didn't end with a full belly. As the sun lowered in the sky, Mr. Periwinkle announced we'd have a special campfire in honor of the momentous day. Not too long after that, Josh, Allison, and I found ourselves sitting on the log of honor, closest to the crackling fire. It had a great view, but my eyes burned from all the smoke that kept blowing in my face. Directly behind us sat Fernando, Stinky, Thorin, and a group of Allison's friends, who were now packed rather tightly around Fernando. I was pleased to notice that the Algonquins had decided to boycott the campfire, and that Lutz-Kraut and her crew were nowhere in sight. For entertainment, the counselors performed skits. Wu played the trumpet, and Gertrude and Alice did an interesting, if not a little weird, musical number by banging on a bunch of pots and pans. When they finished, Mr. Periwinkle stepped up to speak. "As you know, camp ends in 2 days. 2 more days to enjoy everything that Mother Nature has to offer us in this magnificent evening. Of course, we will have many more summers now, thanks to Rodney Rathbone and his canoe mates." Periwinkle waited for the crowd to quiet down as a round of cheers came about. "I want to remind everyone, the last day of camp award ceremony is coming in 2 days. After your parents have settled in, we will hand out the many summer awards, all leading up to the most important honor, the honor that you will decide by camp vote tomorrow. I am referring to none other than the annual naming of King and Queen. Why me?" He paused for a moment, his face becoming more serious. "Yes, it's no ordinary award. As many of you know, the King and Queen, under Camp YME bylaws, have the power to change one camp rule or influence one camp decision." Make a camp decision? What was this? They let kids decide policy? I smelled potential disaster and raised my hand. Periwinkle looked down at me and smiled. I know what you're thinking, Rodney. It's one of those brilliant rules that distinguishes Camp Waimea from other camps. When we say the opinion of the camper matters, we mean it. Some people clapped. I began to sweat. Periwinkle continued. For example, has anyone had to eat Gertrude's salmon loaf this summer? No! Cheered my fellow campers. Gertrude looked taken aback. Alice pretended to threaten Periwinkle with a wooden spoon, and everyone laughed. Precisely, he continued. It's an example of a policy change made by a former camp king and queen after spending an unfortunate night in the infirmary. I couldn't take it anymore and had to ask the question that was making me sick. Could the king and queen decide to tear down the trees and develop the camp? I blurted. Mr. Periwinkle frowned. I'd have to ask the lawyers. But why on earth would you want to do that? Well, I wouldn't. But what if someone whose father stood to make millions of dollars would happen to do that? Mr. Periwinkle laughed. Rodney, it's like a big popularity contest. Everyone's going to vote for you. He laughed more nervously this time and turned to the crowd. Aren't I right? Yeah! The crowd screamed before breaking into chants of Rodney, Rodney, Rodney. You would assume hearing the cheers would make me feel pretty good, but as I sat there before the fire, I couldn't shake the thought, what if I don't win? When the chants finally died down, Mr. Periwinkle announced, All right, it's getting late. There's only one more thing to do this summer to complete the ultimate camp experience. It's time for the greatest of all camp traditions. I noticed Mrs. Periwinkle walking toward us. My mind raced with unlikely camp traditions. Was she about to walk barefoot on burning coals, reenact someone getting burned at the stake? This was getting interesting, until I noticed her take a seat in front of her husband. Mr. Periwinkle gave her a big smile and turned to the rest of us. Campers, it's time for that great Camp Waimea tradition, a fireside ghost story. Steve? A scary story? This was one camp experience I could do without. Survival Steve appeared out of the smoke. I'm gonna tell you a story. It's a darn scary one, and it's true. So if you don't think you can take it, you best leave now. I began to rise, but then Steve added, It's called The Legend of Greenie. My fellow campers snickered. Someone called, Ooh, Greenie. I better cover my ears. Even Stinky, who was scared of just about everything, had a smile on his face. Greenie? How scary could this be? I looked over at Allison and we both smiled. I settled back onto the log of honor and decided to enjoy the story. Maybe it would get my mind off this King Waimea stuff. Steve's face remained dark as he looked around at each of us. Flames from the fire reflected in his eyes. His voice dropped to a deep, unsettling level. We'll see how many of you are laughing. When the fire dies low, you're alone and the thoughts of Greenie come back to haunt you. Again there was a laughter, although it sounded a bit uneasy. The tale starts 20 years ago. A boy not much older than most of you sitting before me was arrested. The crime was so gruesome and horrible that I could never live with myself if I described it to you now. But I can tell you that the judge and half the jury that listened to the case went crazy. He paused, one nervous giggle. I felt my chest begin to tighten. I also felt Allison nestling closer to me. I liked that, although it reminded me of a rather unpleasant memory involving Jessica, a scary movie, and a Coke. At least this time there was no soda for me to spill on Allison. The boy, Steve continued, was sent to Screw Loose Asylum for violent offenders. The same Screw Loose Asylum that wasn't too far from Camp Waimea. The boy was so savage and dangerous that they stuck him in the thickest padded cell in the deepest basement. But it wasn't enough. In less than a year, he managed to escape. I glanced behind me. So many girls now clung to Fernando that he looked like a human magnet. The manhunt lasted a whole year. Hundreds of police, bloodhounds, helicopters, and even a psychic failed to find him. He had disappeared into the woods. These woods, Steve exclaimed, motioning all around us. Allison's hand gripped my bicep. Stinky chewed his sweatshirt sleeve. Josh sat with a dopey grin. Every now and then, people thought they saw him, a boy gradually becoming a man and turning green from living alone like an animal in the woods. These woods. Every now and then a hiker or a boater or a camper would disappear. Some foolish people said these people just ran away or moved, but deep down everyone knew what had really happened. Greenie got them. I looked over and I realized I was now gripping Allison's bicep. Good thing I'm not holding a Coke, I thought. And then the sightings ended. People stopped going missing, and the citizens in the towns around Camp Wyoming forgot about Greenie. That was good, I thought. I took a deep breath. Survival Steve raised his pointer finger in the smoky air and paused momentarily. However, the people should have been more careful. They should not have forgotten about Greenie. They should have remembered that he was still out there somewhere, hiding in the woods. Parents should have thought twice about sending their little loved ones off to camp. My heart was in my throat. Steve leaned down over the fire and took on an orange glow of his own. Yes, your parents never should have sent you here. And you shouldn't be sitting around this fire right now. Do you know why? No one could answer. Because I'm Greenie! He shouted, leaping right into the fire. Ah! Everyone except Josh screamed. Mr. Periwinkle bolted off into the woods. Allison and I flipped backward, falling off the log. She landed on me with a thud. For a second, I was in a fear-induced coma. But as I came out of it, I realized that someone was actually laughing. I strained my eyes to look up, and there was Steve, tears streaming down his face. Boy, that was fun. Nothing like a good old ghost story around the campfire. Allison, who was taking her time getting off my chest, said, Your friend has a weird sense of humor. That's one way to describe it, I muttered. And look at you lying there. What about protecting me from Greenie? At least I broke your fall. She smiled at that. My hero. Then her eyes looked more closely into mine, and I felt my heart begin to hammer in my chest. It's kind of sad, she continued. The end of camp is in 2 days. After that, we go home. Was all I managed to reply. She kept looking at me expectantly, slowly twirling her strands of red hair. Did she want me to kiss her? Looking at her in the firelight, I wanted to, but another part of me wrestled with the same Jessica questions I had battled all summer. My heart beat faster. My mind grew hazy. Jessica was miles away. I knew I had to. Would someone please find my husband? Mrs. Periwinkle demanded. He's heard that stupid story for 19 years and runs every time. She noticed us on the ground and asked, What are you two doing down there? Get up! Focusing her gaze squarely on Allison, she scolded, I can tell you one thing, young lady. You'd never catch a nice girl like Rodwina rolling around in the pine needles. I wouldn't be so sure of that, Allison said. Mrs. Periwinkle had broken the mood and saved me from an awkward situation. As she walked off with her friends, Allison gave me a little wave. I waved back. The campfire was over, and there was a lot to digest. Needing time to think, I cut away from the crowd of boys heading back to the cabin. I realized that I would soon have to face the decision I'd been avoiding for much of the summer. In 2 days, I'd finally be seeing Jessica. Was she still my girlfriend? There was a slight chance she was, but Allison, I couldn't deny how I felt about her. My mind was wrestling with the girl dilemma when I rounded out from behind a row of thick pine trees and onto the soccer field. Something caught my eye and stopped me dead in my tracks. Up on the Periwinkle's balcony, Mrs. Lutschkraut sat rocking slowly in a chair. I could see a smile etched on her face in the moonlight. I stood there watching her rock back and forth. Why was she smiling? Considering that she had just lost her chance to sell the camp, she should have been packed and gone by now, and definitely not smiling. Of course. Was she planning something? Without warning, her head swiveled sharply in my direction. I panicked and dove into the trees, not sure if she saw me. Fear coursed through my entire body. Within the past 24 hours, I had confronted bikers, slept out under Skull Rock, been chased by zombie hillbillies, barely survived Brokeneck Rapids, and been scared out of my wits by a ghost story. How much could one coward take? I didn't stick around to find out. Before Mrs. Luteskraut or Greenie or Todd could catch me alone in the woods, I took off at full speed for the one place I felt safe, Loserville. Chapter 25, Under the Old Beech Tree. Awakening from a horrendous nightmare, I flung myself out of bed, still wrapped in my sleeping bag, and tumbled to the cabin floor like some loser in a potato sack race. Luckily, my face broke my fall. When the pain eventually subsided to excruciating, I eyed the room and noticed that everyone seemed to be up and gone already. At least no one had witnessed the nosedive. What had made me jump out of bed like that? I unzipped the steamy sleeping bag. As the cool morning air rushed in, I lay there trying to remember the nightmare. Staring up at the beams, I noticed a spider watching me from the corner of its web. It was hairy and creepy and reminded me of Mrs. Luteskraut. That's it. I remembered the dream. Mrs. Luteskraut had been smiling evilly at me in the moonlight, rocking back and forth in her chair. It was all too horrifying. I exhaled and said aloud, "Thank goodness it was only a crap." "Did you have an accident, Rodney?" Stinky asked from the doorway. "What? No. Wait a second, where is everyone?" "They're all coming back from breakfast. We decided to let you sleep. You were tossing and turning all night. Hey, don't worry about the accident. I have them all the time. Just the other day Frank, did you see Periwinkle? I have to talk to him. I saw him walk me to his tree. But I don't think you have to tell him. Just take a shower and change. I'll see you later, Frank. Good talk. Remind me never to borrow your shorts." I left Stinky standing there looking perplexed. My dream was no dream. Luteskraut had been smiling up on the porch. If there's one thing I'd learned this past year, it's that a happy Luteskraut is a dangerous Luteskraut. She had a plan, all right, and I needed to stop it. Warning Periwinkle was the first and most important step. I dodged most of the campers who tried to congratulate me on the race, but one was a bit more aggressive. Practically tackling me, Tabitha said, "Rodney, where are you going so fast?" "I have something to take care of," I panted, trying to step around her. She blocked my course. "Are you up to one of your adventures?" I smiled weakly. "You know," she continued, "that canoe race was amazing. I was in the other canoe and all, but I was rooting for you." She smiled and leaned closer. "I can't believe you went down Brokeneck Rapids. That's very exciting." "Yeah, it was. Now I really need." She grabbed my hand. "Rodney, I was just on my way to vote for the Camp Wyoming king and queen. I'll vote for you if you vote for me. Wouldn't we make an awesome royal couple?" Sure. Bet we would. Now I really need to go." She looked puzzled as I took off around her. A few seconds later, she yelled, "Hey!" But I kept moving across the soccer field. The beech tree was in my sights. As I sprinted up the final steps to the tree, I could see Mr. Periwinkle sitting in a plaid folding chair, enjoying his favorite views. I bent over to catch my breath before sputtering, "Mr. Periwinkle, Mrs. Luteskraut, she's up to something." "Of course she's up to something." "She's helping to arrange the end of summer award ceremony. Isn't that right, Helga?" I was still bent over. "Helga?" I raised my eyes. Just to Periwinkle's left sat his sister-in-law and wife. Mrs. Periwinkle was looking at me with a serious expression, but Luteskraut wore a devious smirk. She said, "That's right, Percy. I'm helping to make sure the camp grand finale goes off without a hitch." Red flags smacked me in the face with each word, but Periwinkle just kept on beaming. "Isn't that wonderful, Rodney? There's a lesson here. Mrs. Luteskraut suffered a disappointment, but instead of dwelling on it, she's accepted it, embraced our vision of the camp, and offered to help. Truly a noble gesture. Wouldn't you agree?" "No!" I shouted. This was no time for tact. Mr. Periwinkle, you couldn't possibly trust her. Rodney, that's rather rude. Mrs. Lutescrout is sitting right here. She was just telling me how she'd been mistaken all along. The money blinded her, and now she sees what's really important. Isn't that true, Helga? That's right, Rodney, she answered, not looking at me but staring straight ahead. Look at that view. To think I almost uprooted acres of poisoned ivy and killed thousands of innocent mosquitoes. And for what? Millions and millions of dollars. What could I have been thinking? Mr. Periwinkle nodded. Everyone deserves a second chance. Mrs. Periwinkle kept her mouth shut and tried to look calm, but her eyes told a different story. She was staring at me so intently that she seemed to be trying to see right through me. It was kind of freaky, so I looked back at Mr. Periwinkle. He picked up a glass of lemonade from where it was balanced between two roots, took a long sip, and placed it on the ground. I'm just so thrilled. You've seen the light, Helga. He smiled. Me too, Percy. I can rest easy now, knowing that dirty little campers will be scurrying over these grounds for generations to come. Turning to me, she suddenly asked, Did you vote for King and Queen? I hear you're the favorite. Just imagine, one of my former students, King, why me? You have no idea how that makes me feel. The sarcasm and wickedness dripped off each syllable. My throat was dry. So this was how she intended to destroy the camp. She was going to rig the King and Queen elections. Mr. Periwinkle beamed. Oh, Helga, this is going to be a glorious end of the summer. Glorious will be an understatement, she said, still smiling at me. It will be the happiest day of my life. I had to try one last time. Mr. Periwinkle, there's too much at stake for second chances. Don't you see? She's going to... Now, Rodney, don't be so suspicious. It's bad for the digestion. Helga, reassure poor Rodney that you no longer care about developing Camp Why Me. Why, Percy, I'm hurt that you would even suggest such a thing. Her bottom lip began to quiver. A deal, and I intend to honor my end of the bargain. You see, Rodney, she's a picture of sincerity. As Mr. Periwinkle leaned over to pick up his lemonade, Miss Sincerity gave me a nasty wink and held up two crossed fingers. What? Mr. Periwinkle barked. Oh, good, he had spotted her. Now he'd listen to reason. There's an ant in my glass. Little guy is trying to drink my lemonade. Of course he hadn't seen her. Mrs. Lutescrout was too good at this. I don't blame the little creature, he continued. Mrs. Periwinkle makes the best lemonade in all Ohio. Don't you, Agatha? I looked at Mrs. Periwinkle. She didn't react to the compliment. Her eyes were still drilling into me. Mr. Periwinkle gently dropped the ant to the grass. Next time we'll bring a whole pitcher of lemonade just for the bugs. Mrs. Periwinkle ignored her husband and asked me, Who was that you were speaking to down on the fields? I didn't see the harm in telling the truth. Tabitha. The name wiped the smirk right off Lutescrout's face. She blurted, Tabitha! Isn't that the one you recommended, Hagatha? If Rodney's got his hooks into her. She caught herself. Although she tried to regain her easygoing, relaxed act, the eye twitch I'd come to know so well had returned. She half mumbled, We'll talk later. Then, a little more loudly, she spat, Rodney, I think it's time for you to go. Still smiling, Mr. Periwinkle said, Yes, go vote, Rodney, and get some rest tonight. Big day tomorrow. Well, at least he was right about one thing. Tomorrow would be a big day. I wandered out onto the fields and did my best to sort things out. I tried all afternoon. Later, though, while brushing my teeth in the bathroom before bed, I realized I hadn't gotten anywhere. Sure, I had an idea of what Lutescrout was up to, but I didn't know how to stop her. My friends had been no help at all. They just laughed. Woo's advice was to chill, and he played me some new jazz music that sounded like a bunch of geese getting run over. So I went looking for Allison, only every time I tried to talk to her, there were other kids around. Nope, this time I was definitely on my own. It seemed no one could grasp the obvious. Lutz-Kraut was prepared to stop at nothing to get her way. I finished in the bathroom and walked out into the darkening evening. Most campers were already in bed. I was alone on the trail that cut through the pines back to Loserville. I came around one particularly large tree and stopped short. There was something odd about the shadows coming from behind that tree. I snuck off the path and came around the tree from the rear. Todd and Magnus lurked. "I'm gootin' tired of waitin'," Magnus whispered. "Just a bit longer," Todd whispered back. "He's gotta come this way soon. It's our last chance to give him a little going away present." My instincts had saved me again. I slid back quietly into the dark. Their last chance was blown. I was safe. I relaxed and was just starting to sneak off when an icy hand gripped my shoulder. "Say nothing, just listen." The mystery killer in the dark didn't have to worry. I was too terrified to even gasp. The hand spun me around so I could see my end. A faint light from the moon revealed Mrs. Periwinkle's face. It brought little relief. She growled quietly, "I've been looking all over for you. We need to talk." My heart pounded in my chest until I managed, "You could have waited until breakfast." "No, I couldn't," she hissed. "We can't be seen together and we haven't much time." This was almost as scary as her icy hand. I squeaked, "Why? What's going on?" "Your suspicions earlier today were justified. My sister's going to change the election results so that you lose. We have only one chance to save the camp, and you're that chance." Something wasn't making sense. "Mrs. Periwinkle," I asked, "I thought you didn't want the camp saved. I thought you wanted all the money." "Oh, that doesn't matter anymore. I was wrong. What matters is that I'm desperate. I need to know if I can count on you. I need to know. Can I count on your help, Rodwina?" And that's the end of the chapter.